Secretary Chapman, Office of Consumer Affairs and Business Regulation.
Jessica Casey, Plymouth.
Joe Coughlin, Plymouth.
Hein Dubois, Speaker of the House.
Dave Johnston, Mass DP, on behalf of Matt Beaton, Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs.
Rich Grassi, Plymouth.
Heather Leitner, Plymouth.
Kurt Schwartz, MEMA.
Sean Mullen, Plymouth.
Dave Nichols, appointed by Governor Baker.
John Orenberger, Entergy.
Kevin O'Reilly, Plymouth.
Jack Priest, Department of Public Health.
Paul Smith, Utility Workers Union of America.
Joe Lynch, Entergy, from Mike Toomey.
Dan Wolf, appointment of the Senate President.
Pat Chiramella and Bob Hayden have just arrived as well, so we see you here. Might be some moving around. You don't have to sit in alphabetical order, you can sit wherever you want. And we know that Selectman Mahoney is outside. He'll be in shortly. What we're going to do at first is review the 3 sets of minutes. As many of you probably noticed, and I'm sure you've all read, if you couldn't sleep, I emailed out on the 20th and 22nd of June, and now again on July 12th, 3 sets of minutes. The first one is the May 17th
Oh, I never read all.
minutes. You may recall at the last meeting, we agreed to deal with these today so people would have a little bit more time. Are there any edits, notes to the changes to the May 17th copy of the minutes?
Can't say I read those.
Move to accept.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Unanimously adopted. We'll move on to the minutes from the June 7th meeting. Any comments, edits, changes to those minutes?
Move to accept.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Any opposed? Unanimous. The June 20th meeting, a little bit more recent. Any comments, changes, suggestions? Yes, Joe Coughlin.
On page 5, kind of in the middle, might want to add at the end of the line that says review and approval by the NRC and 2 decommissioning financial protection plans.
Are you on line 30, Joe?
It's not numbered when I printed it out.
4th paragraph.
That's line 30, Alan.
Yeah. If it means, well, no, just add after the end of that sentence where it says plans and decommissioning trust fund, there were 2 financial issues that were recommendations, not just that one. And the second one, I don't recall being actually discussed. It's accurate the way it is up until that point, where the second one is just not mentioned.
Do you want to just send a slight revision to Alan? Because it'll be a lot easier for him to work off of that.
Sure.
And then we'll defer this until the next meeting, and we'll take a look at it then.
Sure.
Okay? Are there any other?
If you want to go ahead and approve it with that slight modification, just adding decommissioning trust fund, that's your call.
We can certainly, is there a motion to accept that change?
So moved.
Second?
I'll second it.
All in favor? All opposed? Do you have that change, Alan? Okay. The minutes are accepted. I'm going to add a quick new agenda item. Kurt's going to give us an update on the administration's activities with forming the Interagency Working Group and also Secretary Beaton's office. So, Kurt?
Well, thank you, everybody. Just for everybody's awareness, the administration is moving forward with the formation of an interagency working group. I believe I reported on this at the last meeting as well, but at the direction of the governor, the interagency working group will be housed within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and that will place it under the overall supervision of Secretary Beaton who is the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs. The Cabinet, the Governor's Cabinet Affairs Group has been working to and has identified both the state agencies that will participate in the working group, and I believe now all agencies have designated the individual or individuals who will be part of the working group. I anticipate that the working group will meet for the first time within the next just few weeks. Scheduling is taking place now with proposed dates flying around. It's normal difficulties with it being summer. Believe it or not, state employees, we do take occasional vacations, but it should be within the next few weeks. And the plan remains the same as was previously discussed, that the working group will ultimately be supported by a vendor consultant, by private sector consultant that will be retained to support the working group going forward. So that is happening, and first meeting should be within the next just few weeks. Still to be worked out, but I've raised this and have had discussions. We will, and hopefully by even well, we're not meeting in August, but certainly by the next meeting, I'll be able to report back how we're going to establish the liaison and relationship between this panel and the working group. You know, it may be that one of the state people on the panel will be the liaison and relationship and form that relationship with the working group. But we are working that, and we'll make sure that there is something in place to ensure the relationship and the flow of information both ways. So.
Can you tell us how many agencies or who?
Well, I don't have the list in front of me, but I can tell you that there are agencies and representatives of, I think, every secretariat with the exception of probably education and technology services. So you'll see public safety, energy, environmental affairs, health and human services, housing and economic development, labor workforce. And then the number of agencies, it is certainly north of 8, I think.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
and certainly by the time we come together next time, I think I'll be either I or whoever's going to be the liaison will be more formally report on the who and the what. So.
Any other questions of Kurt before we move on to the next agenda item? Okay. With that, the primary purpose of this evening's meeting, of course, is to review and get, at least hopefully in my mind, approval of the first annual draft report. I just want to make a couple of introductory remarks about it. It's a living document. It's not a perfect document. It's a snapshot in time. One of the things that I personally think, and having had a hand in writing it and alienating some of you by deleting things and changing things a little bit, I think, for example, that we ought to remove the section that talks about the creation of a hotline. It's a difficult and virtually unworkable situation, but it has to go hand in hand, in my mind, and I know several of yours, with the fact that the website needs to be significantly upgraded. There has to be a forum for folks to, the public and experts elsewhere, to log in and comment on what we're doing. The website is that forum rather than a hotline. And so I would like to first preface our discussion on the report by, I think we ought to remove that one particular thing. That's my opinion, and we'll talk about that. I also think that the administration in particular has been, I think, very, very responsive in this. They've reviewed it, they're involved in it, they're fully engaged, they're putting together the interagency work group, and they are in support of this document, and Kurt can contradict me if I'm wrong here, but the administration and the agencies involved are in support of the document as it stands without any substantive or substantial changes. So whatever we discuss tonight, I would really, really like us not to make any major changes to the report the way it is now. If there's minor changes, that's great. At some point, I would like someone to make a motion to accept it with that one change that I've mentioned and perhaps some others. But this is a report that stands as it stands for the time. It doesn't mean it's our final definitive position or recommendation on anything. More topics, more experts, more input and discussion need to be had over the months to come. We're really just beginning our work rather than ending it, but I would like to get this report done now in a timely way. And with that, I will open it up to discussion. If anybody's got any changes they would like the panel to discuss, and then we can, I hope, somebody will call for a vote on the document the way it is. Any discussion? Yes, Pine?
Mr. Chairman, I think, as you know, the site cleanup and restoration work group just had a meeting prior to this, and in part because the recommendations that we had made had substantially been reordered, let me say. And there's one recommendation that is within the context of our group that we had not discussed before, so we discussed that. And we do have some language, I would call it more wordsmithing than anything, but with that, we had 4 or 5 voting with 1 absent in positive. And Dave Johnston has that language if you want
Can you
us to read
Dave?
it.
Yeah.
It would be on page 21 of the document, under the recommendation for the site cleanup and restoration group.
So page 21, up the top of the page where it says recommendations. This recommendation was attributed to our group, but in fact, I think was worked out in another group. So we reviewed it, thought we should endorse it and vote to endorse it. And as we talked about it, we had a couple of concerns about the exact wording. So for this group to consider, we're proposing we change the wording as follows. And you folks just need to know that the way after changing the wording for your consideration, we voted to affirm it. So it would read, instead of what's presently on the page here, it would read, the panel recommends that the Commonwealth and Entergy enter into a memorandum of understanding that defines the scope for the continued on-site and off-site environmental, meteorological, and radiological monitoring throughout the decommissioning process and until all spent fuel is moved off-site, binding upon Entergy and any successors. So the nuance there is, as it's presently stated, it talks about a sort of an outright requirement. As it is restated, it talks about a process to determine exactly what Entergy is going to be required to do.
Let me just ask, in the group voted 5 in favor and 1 abstention?
It was 4 in favor with 1 absent.
1 absent, okay. Do you want to make this as a motion to just replace this?
Yes, I would like to make the motion that if it's going to stay within our group heading, that this be adopted,
Okay.
the way Dave read it.
Is there any comment, question on the motion? Hearing none, is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Then it'll be adopted, and if you could just email that to me, I'll put it in.
Will do.
Are there any other changes that anybody wants to discuss or make? Yes, Joseph?
The email that I had sent you last week,
Mhm.
will the activities for the PSDAR be put in the draft that goes, or the version that goes forward?
I did not add that, Joe, because,
No,
yeah,
I understand for this draft,
that's right.
but,
In the future, it'll certainly be taken up.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
okay. And as just a small editorial consideration, throughout the listing of the recommendations of the different work groups, most of them start out by saying, the panel recommends. Do you want to say that, or do you want to say the work group recommends? Because it starts out by saying, NDCAP and the panel recommends the four that the panel that are in the front.
Yeah.
Then you get into the work groups.
I can tell you that, from a wordsmithing point of view, I am responsible, as they say in those things, for the content of this and nobody else, although there were many, many hands involved. I would like to leave it like it is as the panel, because it's the panel voting to adopt this. So even though it may have originated with it, I'd just like to leave it that way. Any other comments or? Hearing none, is there a motion?
So I want to come back formally to, I'm just trying to find it in the, bear with me a second. So on bottom of page 18,
Yes, the establishment of the hotline.
the observation and recommendation concerning establishing a hotline to receive anonymous information. I would like to move that we strike that. I have had this conversation with the administration. This is the only recommendation that the administration feels strongly that the administration can't support, and it puts a obligation, a burden that we're not prepared as administration to take up. So I would move to strike that from the report.
And I,
Second.
Point of information
Yes,
before
sir.
we vote on that. So might I understand that the administration has reviewed these recommendations and actually censored what our recommendations are?
Well, let me speak to that. So the administration has reviewed draft 5. Nobody has censored anything. This is why I am making a motion. The administration isn't censoring, editing, and has no ability to do that. I'm just reporting back that this is of concern to the administration, and I am, as a panel member, moving that it be struck.
and I can just expand that, Paul, that everyone we've talked to in the administration sitting at the table here has been terrifically supportive, and it's gone back and forth. They certainly haven't tried, anybody, including the designees on the panel, haven't tried to sway the document in any way, so there's been no censoring or anything like that. But I agree with this. This is unworkable, but it has to go hand in hand, and this is a subject matter for future meetings, with improvements to the website so that folks have a vehicle to register concerns or to make comments. So I'd like to hold that off till September, but anybody want a second? Kurt's second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Hearing none, it's gone. That'll be deleted. All right. Now,
Before you get a motion to approve, just one other issue that it's probably just a wordsmithing change when we talk about the NDCAP activities,
Yep.
but I was reminded of it when I got an email earlier this week about comments from the public, that on the website, there is, at least in some instances, comments that the panel has received, whether it's a letter from the delegation. I'm not sure the report really reflects the feedback that we've gotten from the public as far as being available. And I think we might want to just consider, I mean, we say the schedule of meetings on page 5, scheduled meetings and minutes of all the meetings can be found, and it gives the website address. But I think there's also feedback that the panel has received from external people, whether it's comments from the public or experts, and some of that's in there.
So, so what is on the website are materials that were presented or provided or discussed at our panel meetings. So those are the materials. So when we had a presenter that used a PowerPoint, those were included on the website.
So it's not all the public comments then that are available?
No, and
I know I could find some, but,
yeah,
okay. I withdraw
Okay.
my issue. At some point down the road, we probably should find a way to
we have to do it.
reflect the
Absolutely.
comments we're getting from the public,
And yeah, it's,
whether we agree with them or not.
yeah, to make sure that everybody's aware that they're there, and that's what somebody's, I agree, Dave.
Can I ask another question? So on page 3, we make a reference to an executive summary to be drafted.
Yep.
I'm just wondering whether we just strike, it's not such a long
Yeah.
report, I would suggest we just strike and not do an executive summary?
Again, the pride of
Okay.
authorship here, I have no problem with that. Has anybody got a motion or,
I'm sorry,
so
what?
moved? Seconded?
Motion to strike this. because this report is so short.
All in favor? Aye. Done. Thank you, that saves me trouble. Copy and paste.
Can I have one,
Yeah, sure.
on page 16, under safety and security, it's talking, the recommendation talks about asking Entergy to use the most current and adapted climate model projections and security information to locate and construct the second pad, and as necessary, address the current cast pad to eliminate all risk of coastal flooding. I just had thought that maybe we could also add, and to provide that info to the panel and the working group. Because if they do all this work and develop all this stuff
So-
and don't give it to us,
Yeah.
I don't
and
know what good it is.
So you'd
but
put in, let me just make
just
sure.
adding at the end of that sentence a comma and saying, and provide that information to the panel and the work group, the interagency work group, as I understand it,
And provide such information to the interagency work group and to the NDCAP.
and to the NDCAP, right. So I just,
You want to make that as a motion, Pine?
if
Yeah.
the chair would so entertain.
Sure. Do you, a question, comment?
My only comment is, instead of provide, present, because provide kind of.
Yeah, yes, I accept that.
Present's
I
fine?
understand.
I'll read it back, Joe, before we. Okay. Any other comment on it?
Just one comment.
Yes.
If we remove the executive summary, is it possible to add a section in at the beginning that speaks to next steps, where the panel intends to meet as laid out in the legislation with the working groups and so on and so forth? So I'm just, basically what we've said is, we would bring forward an annual report that we would meet so many times. We would bring forward a set of recommendations, and we've done all of that, but I don't think, if we get rid of the executive summary, then we're sort of just missing that 2 sentences that say, and the panel will continue to work as we have in the first year.
Perhaps, so I see what, perhaps just in the introduction, as
At the end of
we
the
add a
introduction.
third paragraph that says that the panel will continue to meet for the indefinite future on a monthly basis. Working groups will continue to meet, and we will continue to publish annual reports.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep, just to bookend
Yeah.
it.
You trust me to write something sensible and brief?
Yes.
Is there a motion to accept that?
If I could just make
Yeah.
a comment, we stay consistent with the language in the legislation, not monthly, but at least quarterly or something like that.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't, yeah, you guys tell me how you want it written, and I'm pretty much happy with it. Just, the panel will continue to meet in accordance with the legislation. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Any other comment? The motion?
So move.
All in favor? Aye. All opposed? That passes, so that'll be added as a third paragraph, Jessica. Any other comments? Hearing none, anybody want to make a motion to accept it as amended and agreed to?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Passes unanimously.
Can I applaud?
Good job. Good job, everybody. Now, we'll go on to the updates from Joe. So, Joe, you're getting started much earlier than expected, and we all look forward to hearing.
I'm actually going to surprise all of you and introduce John Orenberger, who will give the first presentation.
Okay.
All right, do we have controller or just up there? I think I'll
It's
probably
going to be
want
weak, because it's going to be me.
I don't know, I didn't.
Probably want to be up by the screen for some of the shots, or some of the slides. The first part of the presentation has to do with the siting of the asphyxie pad and our analysis that we're doing for.
Yeah.
Sorry, can we drop this on
Yeah,
the
we may
screen
need,
so-
we may need a little technical help I don't know if that one's right. Yeah.
After that, it's up to the TV guy.
Question of turning on the other projector.
No, John, you'll have to stand there with your foot on it.
I can do that.
Let me see if there's someone that can help us with the. Click it on.
Lights on. Come on. At least that's what it looks like.
Thank you.
Maybe not, it's not getting brighter.
May take a while to warm up, but. Excuse me.
There you go.
Thank you.
Now it's on.
I could probably get started with that slide, and then I'll point out I just want to show some location, we have a location photo here to show the different areas that we're looking at for each one of the cask sightings or spent fuel pad sightings, so we'll take a look at that. So just as an update, and some of this is repeat from previous presentation that Joe and I have made actually, for the dry fuel storage. So we currently have one operational Isfisi pad. It has a capacity of 40 casks, but we're administratively limited to 38 casks. The reason for that is we have to facilitate shuffling casks around on the pad, and the locations that we leave open are all regulated. So we have to have enough, seismically and weight distribution and so forth. So we keep 2 open locations so that we can shuffle casks around in case we have to do anything with one of the casks. We have 9 loaded casks right now. Each one has 68 fuel assemblies in it. We'll have a total of 17 casks by October of this year loaded and on the pad for approximately 1,156 fuel bundles in dry storage. In order to complete the full offload of the spent fuel pool, we'll have to add a pad or add to the pad that we currently have, or build a second pad at a different location. I'll show you that as we go along. And currently we're in the design and engineering and vendor selection analysis right now for various aspects of that project. So the design, engineering, and vendor selection will determine the specifics such as the size of the pad, total number of cast systems, and so forth. There's a lot that goes into it, and I'll talk through some of the challenges that we have. Yeah.
So the 17 casks, are they all gonna be the Holtec 100?
Correct.
And at the last statement, it said cask systems. Are you considering other systems than the Holtec 100?
At this time, we're evaluating for the Holtec 100 system. Okay, so obviously, the decommissioning planning organization, my organization, has undertaken the plan for the addition of the current pad, or we have 2 other locations that I'll show you. We're taking on that project to get the second pad or get the remainder of the casks, to facilitate those getting onto the getting into dry storage, all the spent fuel.
John, are you going to send this to us so that we don't have to take copious notes?
Can you do that? Yeah.
Thank you.
Joe says he'll take care of that. Okay, and then some of the things that we really, we really look into very deeply, a lot of technical research that we do for this as far as siting the pad, all considered right here
on those 6 bullets, the physical engineering design considerations, security requirements, NRC regulations and approval, various permitting, because there's a lot of stuff around permitting, environmental considerations, then the impact on future decommissioning activities at the site. So we're evaluating 3 locations right now for the asphyxie pad. If you want to move on, Joe, I'll show you where they are. This is a picture of Pilgrim Station, satellite picture of Pilgrim Station. I'll just point out a few things. Here's the reactor building, the turbine building here. This is our warehouse and operations and maintenance building, some outbuildings for our outage groups that come in, engineering building here, regular parking and so forth up through here. Plant North, we call this, you know, that direction out into the ocean. It's not quite Plant North, but we call that Plant North. The current pad is right here. This photo shows 8 casks on that pad. There's a 9th one on there right now, and we're moving through a campaign as we speak. The reactor building truck lock, we pull casks out of here, and we bring them over on a crawler that brings them out to that location and transports them, you know, onto the pad. The southeast location is behind one of our outbuildings that we use for outage, mostly outage activities. The west pad, west of the building itself, the reactor building and turbine building itself. That west pad would be an addition to the current pad that we have, and then the southwest pad would be on our an old parking lot that we have near our INS building.
John, can I ask a question?
Sure.
The next pad, is it being considered during this planning process and all what the engineering doing, that it will ultimately hold all of the casks and the existing one will be used for some other purpose?
That would be part of the consideration, not necessarily, but there's some advantages to having one protected area for all the fuel.
From a security?
And from a security standpoint of view, from an operations standpoint of view, and surveillance standpoint of view with all those, with all the casks. More of an advantage of having everything in one location than not to have everything in one location. But, you know, once again,
But it is under consideration.
We're still in the study period right now.
That is under consideration.
Yes. Okay, so if we just go, well, I'm going to toggle back between the next slide and I'll come back and just talk through a couple of things just so I make sure I keep my notes. We'll talk about the southeast location. Some of the challenges that we have is the haul path. Along the haul path, the underground utilities. Each cask weighs upwards of 375,000 pounds. We have to be careful of what's underground there for utilities. And the overhead transmission lines, if you want to go back, Joe, just overhead transmission lines, although will be shut down, the overhead transmission lines come across here and onto the turbine building. We have to be cognizant of those overhead transmission lines. We will be using those lines for, or potentially using those overhead lines for some backup power if we need that along the, you know, during the safe store, the beginnings of the safe store period. So those are the 2 challenges right there. We'd be coming out of the reactor building truck lock, like I said, up there, and coming around through here to get the casks back here. Lots of underground utilities there that we would have to engineer carrying that kind of load over. Okay.
John?
Jessica?
From a safety standpoint, if it makes sense to have all of the casks together, and you're considering southwest and also looking at southeast, would you leave the existing pad where it is, or would you move all of the casks to the location that you're choosing?
Once again, sort of on the same answer as Sean's question. We would consider both eventualities, whether it would be okay to have, or better to have the casks split, or all of them in one location.
Is there a preference for a site if you were to have, when and if we're able to move the casks off-site, is there a location that is a preference for being able to lower the risk of the move?
Well, in reality, it would be, part of that evolution could just be to make off-site make them off-site, no matter where we put them. We would just move the protected area. So there's some consideration for that too, where we would change our physical security boundaries. And, you know, so if we were over here, for instance, we can make that area off-site if we want to.
Okay.
By changing our physical boundaries.
Selectman, did you have a question?
John, these two alternatives you're putting forth, were they under consideration when you went for the first one? Were these a couple of the options initially?
Actually, this one, we have some engineering studies on right now, yes. Okay, so as I said, the challenges, once again, the challenges for the southeast pad, haul path and overhead transmission lines for that one. If we can just go forward one. The west location, and that would be the addition to the current pad that we have, a couple of challenges we have. The haul path rework to support the elevation requirements, we would have to do some pretty, heavy work on the standard construction work, but pretty heavy work on the haul path going out to that additional part of the pad, just to get the elevation the right place, so we're not any lower than we are right now. And then eventually for the eventual demolition and decommissioning activities, very close to the other structures, so we're evaluating that right now. If you want to go back, Joe, just for a second, you can see the red square is just approximate, but we'd be pretty close to some of the structures over here, and we're considering, evaluating whether we want to have something there that's so close to the structure for our future decommissioning activities. All right, if we move up one more, Joe. And then the southwest location, the challenges there are the proximity to Rocky Hill Road and then the length of the haul path. If you want to go back, Joe, we would construct a new exit from the site right up through there. Would go to the in the upper center of the picture is our shorefront property. Join the road there, do the haul path all the way up through here, and then onto the upper parking lot right there. So the challenges there are the length of the haul path, once again, and then the proximity to Rocky Hill Road from a security and dose exposure standpoint of view. And we're looking at both of those right now.
Is there a huge difference between the west and the southwest site in regards to elevation?
The southwest site is about 50 feet above the west site. There's right here on the west, sort of southwest side of the current pad, there's a retaining wall right there, and it's about a 50-foot elevation change.
What is it at the southeast?
I'm sorry?
The elevation at the southeast?
The southeast is about a 5-foot elevation above the west right here, depending on exactly where we put it. There is some elevation change, but it's not that much, not as much as 50 feet. Heather?
As part of the consideration for the west side, are you considering anything to sort of make it more protected from Cape Cod Bay, or is that not part of the engineering?
Currently, the only part of the study that we're doing is just the constructability of the actual pad itself. And we have to go through seismic evaluations, core boring for soils analysis and that kind of thing, and then of course the additional work that we would have to do on the approach pad and the haul path for that. Whoa.
John, one quick.
Fine.
Isn't that a new road there that leads practically to the existing, that little slice that's below the south corner of your red square on the southwest thing? So going down the hill, yeah. Isn't that a new road that's there?
There's everything that's there has been there for at least the 25 years.
It's not the $1 million road you were gonna build?
No, we don't. There's no.
Next to that building that's there, I can't remember what you call it.
Right here.
Yeah.
This
Is
right
that a
here?
road?
This is actually a boundary right there. That's not a road.
It's not a road? Okay, thanks.
John, are you considering exclusively 2 pads? Or would you consider the southwest pad accommodating the movement of the west pad to join the southwest pad?
Well, we're evaluating all 3 pads equally for
So
for all
there is a
consideration.
consideration that you would combine them all into a single pad.
Yeah, actually, to Sean's question at the beginning, yes.
I didn't hear
We'd
it, I'm
consider-
sorry.
Yeah, we'd consider both the eventuality of having 2 pads, and we consider the eventuality of having 1 pad.
Saves so much money.
John, where is the security now as far as road access? So is Rocky Hill Road open to the public now?
Rocky Hill Road's open to the public. The Powerhouse Road over here just comes straight out. That's open to the public. However, Entergy owns that road and the property on both sides of that road. We leave that open, but it does have security gates on it if necessary for us, if necessary. But Rocky Hill Road is a public road and, regularly traveled.
Oh, yeah, it's really close.
Any other questions? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's okay, Richard.
Considering that Vermont Yankee is considering movement of the protected area to the pad after or during decommissioning when, at some point, how would that work out here?
Well, we would reconfigure our protected area. The end result that you would have is to have a protected pad with the fuel on it, on its own, the independent spent fuel storage installation, so all independent of the site. So separating the site here, we would separate the site here, we'd separate the site here, by moving our boundaries, separate or build a new one right around there, a new protected area around that, and then that would separate the pad from the site itself. There's regulations relative to the protection and monitoring of the casks that is different from the actual facility after all the fuel is out of the spent fuel pool and onto the pad.
So the current west site is within the protected area,
That is correct.
but the southeast and southwest are outside the protected area, or not? Are they?
Well, I don't know if I can tell you that, but for security reasons, they both are. The southeast side, it was kind of a joke, Rich, sorry about the security thing, but this actually, the layout of this could be right inside it, depending on how we dimension that, or could overlay the current protected area boundary. The one for the southwest side is outside the protected area, current siting that we're looking at right now.
Any other questions?
I didn't hear him.
I think when we've talked about the land that Entergy owns previously, we had talked about the site that the plant will be on. I can't remember the exact number, I think 134 acres or something you'd end up keeping. So whether it be protected or not, does the location of the pad for the alternatives that are shown here, does that impact the number of acres that you would need to keep within that functioning site? What's the delineation between the protected area versus just the site that you would need to have the facility on versus sort of the land that Entergy owns as a whole? And can you provide a little bit of more information on that?
You want to talk through some of the land stuff?
So all the locations that John is referring to is in what we call our industrial part of the site. So that's the 135 acres that is from
I was one off.
Rocky Hill Road to Cape Cod Bay. So it would have no impact on the property across the street, which is the Chapter 61 forest land. So this should have no impact on disposition and potential reuse of the other parts of the property.
Thanks, Joe.
Any other questions? Okay,
Thank you. I think Joe takes over for me.
thank you.
Thank you.
In copies of this will be emailed out. If you, Joe, want to send them to me, and I'll distribute them, or you can send them to all, whatever. Yeah, Absolutely. It'll
Yeah,
be there.
I'll send out copies for everyone.
Thank you.
Next agenda item is to give you an update on the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund. The last time I reported out on the trust fund was in February. I had the data for the January 31st report out. At that time, we had about $1.1 billion, $1.09 billion. The most recent numbers that I got just before I came here were as of June 30th. Currently, the trust fund balance is at $1.055, almost $1.06 billion. Those changes primarily were due to impacts from the market, losses and gains, and then payment of trust expenses. So we do actually pay taxes on any monies that we earn in the trust fund. And my understanding is that since January, the market has gone up about 2.5%. So we probably have seen some gains, but they're offset by the payments of the fees and taxes on the trust fund. To date, we've taken no withdrawals from the trust, so this is the same monies that we've had since Entergy took over the plant and took over responsibility for the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund. As you all know, we are in the planning phase right now. NRC regulations allow you to recoup those costs. So we are keeping track of our costs as either decommissioning planning costs, costs associated with what we call license termination, so that would be the physical removal of buildings and structures and things like that. Obviously, we haven't done any of that yet. We also have an obligation to keep track of all dollars associated with spent fuel management, so that would be the movement of fuel right now and then into the future. And then finally, the last bin is what is known as site restoration, and that's the non-radiological cleanup of the site. That would not be a credible use of the trust fund. So we're keeping track in these 4 particular areas through our accounting, and then at some point in the future, we would have the ability to access the trust fund to recoup those costs that we're now spending. So not a significant update, but I'll be more than happy to answer any questions.
Just one question, how many times a year do you pay fees and taxes?
I believe it's quarterly, so they don't have to pay it all the time, but just looking at the analysis that I get, which I don't understand, kind of like my 401K, but we pay these fees approximately quarterly, and then there's a true-up at the end of the year.
So how does it grow? If the market went up, you had more money, you pay fees and taxes, and the fund goes down. I don't understand how it then grows over time if you're paying that much.
So the true-up happens in the first quarter. So, for example, you make quarterly tax payments based on projections and based on what you actually earned, and then in the first quarter of the next year, you basically true up. It's kind of like paying your own taxes. So we may have had, I don't have the exact numbers, so we may have had to make a substantial tax payment in the first quarter, which is being reflected in the overall balance. So
Thanks.
the good news is, you know, even in what has been kind of a somewhat, you know, topsy-turvy market, we've seen pretty much, you know, steady gains, which is better than obviously significant losses.
Joe, have you made any more contributions to the fund, or is Entergy comfortable with the dollar amount that's in there now, that, assuming whatever the growth projection is, that's going to be sufficient?
We have not made any contributions to the trust fund. There is a regulation that the NRC has and a minimum balance that you are required to keep in the trust fund. We submit that report every March 31st, and I believe the minimum balance for Pilgrim was $660 million. So with us having substantially more than that, we don't need to provide any additional contributions.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Did you have one?
How much do you think you need to decommission Pilgrim?
I don't know that answer simply because we don't have a detailed decommissioning cost estimate, but part of the work scope that Mr. Ornberger has as part of his organization is to develop a very detailed cost study, and I believe that's an ongoing effort.
So I wanted to ask Mr. Ornberger, when he was up there, why he referred to Safe Store.
Safe store we use
It's the
just
only
as-
thing you referred to.
The safe store we use as just as far as the handling of all the fuel, right at the front end of any decommissioning period. And that's to get all the fuel from the spent fuel pool out onto the pad, protected, and separated from the site.
So you
at that point,
you
you're
didn't
in-
use it as an indication that this is what we're planning on as a long-term decommissioning process?
No, it's just a term that we use for that front end, all that front end work that we're doing for configuration of the site.
John, I think the next slide explains what you're saying.
Yeah. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you.
Just back to the decommissioning fund, so can you remind us on how the 696 or whatever that figure was calculated? I feel like when we had talked about it before, it was sort of like if you were to decommission the plant when it was originally being spoken of, that if you had that much in the bank, that it would then sort of, or that much in the fund, that it would basically accrue savings over time, and that you would end up getting to the finish line of what you needed as far as funding was available for the money that was required for the decommissioning. So now that the date has changed for decommissioning, I know that you've reached the number that the NRC has asked you to reach, but how does that number get redefined, or how do you recalculate that number based on the decommissioning date changing?
I'd have to get that answer for you, because I know there's a formula in the NRC regulations that you calculate the number, and I don't know if it takes into consideration that you are going to operate to a certain date or to the end of your license. So I'd have to look into that for you to see where that number came from.
That'd be great, yeah, because I feel like in prior discussions, we had talked about sort of what you would need to get to the certain number by the time you're originally decommissioning. So it'd be good to figure out sort of if there's any revisions that need to be looked at on what that balance needs to be in the account. I mean, I don't know, sounds like with 1 billion, you may be over that, but I'd just be curious to know.
Absolutely, I'll get that
Thanks.
back to everybody as an answer.
Any other questions? Next presentation, Joe?
It's me again. We're going to move on to giving you an update on emergency planning. We had talked about this in some of the earlier meetings, that this was coming up as one of the important milestones as part of the transition from an operating plant to a decommissioned plant. So we put together this draft timeline, and I stress it is draft because we haven't developed our plan. So we put some assumptions in here to kind of give you an idea of what to expect over the next 6 or 7 years. So back in October of 2015, we announced our intention to cease operation. In November of that year, we sent a letter to the NRC notifying them of our intent to cease operations on or about June 1st of 2019. And we are still on track for that. Right after we shut down, we'll go through a period of 4 to 6 weeks to permanently remove all the fuel in the vessel and move that to the spent fuel pool. At that point, we'll then send in 2 additional letters to the NRC, one that we're permanently defueled and one that we have permanently ceased operation. That, in effect, ends our operating license at that point. That will also trigger the first of multiple changes to the emergency plan. With NRC approval, we will then implement what is known as the post-shutdown emergency plan. So that will be coincident with those letters that are being sent into the NRC. We'll then go through a period that we're calling either Phase 1 or Safe Store 1. John alluded to the fact that we use the terminology Safe Store early on in the process. That's about a 10-month period. After 10 months, again, assuming NRC approves our application, we will implement a second change to our emergency plan. That's called the permanently defueled emergency plan. These are all following NRC regulations, not something that we've made up. This has been done by essentially all of the decommissioning plants. We'll remain in the permanently defueled emergency plan for however long it takes to move fuel from wet to dry. As John mentioned, we have 17, we will have 17 canisters this fall. We will likely go right into a campaign to move the fuel shortly after we shut down and transition into the Safe Store 2 period. The guesstimate is that could take anywhere from 2.5 to 4 years, depending on how aggressive the plan is and which technology we choose. If it's the whole tech system, They have made some design changes that allow you to move fuel sooner. Mr. Grassi asked about Vermont Yankee. We loaded cask number 57 out of 58 today. So we have one cask left, and we will be implementing the ISFAC protected area very soon up there and be complete in the next month or so. And that's about 2 years ahead of our original schedule based on the technology changes that we were able to take advantage of using the Holtec 100 system modified. Once all the fuel is on the pad, we will then implement the final changes to our emergency plan. That's called the ISFAC only emergency plan. Again, all of these changes require NRC approval before we can implement these changes. Don't take 2024 as anything more than a projection. At this point, that's just a vision based on some conservative estimates that we've put together. Next slide. So the scope of the emergency plan changes is really based on the change in risk at each phase as we go through our transition to decommissioning. So with the plant shut down and there's no operating reactor anymore, you're really just talking about accidents associated with the storage of fuel, either in wet or on the pad. And then as you go through the periods of time, through the analysis, you'll see the risk lower and you'll be able to change your emergency plans accordingly. So the planned submittals, or the submittals that we've made to date, we have submitted the first license amendment request to the NRC to implement that first change that went in January of this year. That would cover that safe store period 1, which is from plant shutdown and defuel to roughly 10 months later, mid-2020. The second one, which would cover the next period, which we're calling safe store period 2, which would be from mid-2020 till all fuels on the pad, requires 2 submittals. First, it requires us to request exemptions on the current emergency planning regulations from the NRC because the NRC doesn't have decommissioning only regulations. So we have to first get exemptions from the NRC to support then sending in the second submittal. That the one for the EP exemptions went in on July 3rd, and then the one for the actual license amendment request change will be going in. And we haven't got a date, but not too far into the future. They need to kind of be almost coincident so the NRC can review them side by side. And then finally, some years from now, we'll submit the request, the license amendment request for the ISFAC only. Vermont Yankee has already done that, and we expect to receive that very soon, and that will be the final approval to implement the emergency plan with all fuel on the pad. So first, the post-shutdown emergency plan changes. You'll see very little difference once we shut down from what we have right now. It's fully compliant with the existing regulations and guidance. There are no exemptions from current regulations associated with this. On-site and off-site programs are still maintained, and all EP requirements are met, including our drills and exercises, our interface with the local communities, and the emergency planning zone. There will be some changes to on-shift and emergency response organization staffing that's appropriate with a lower level of risk. So essentially, the numbers that we have for our 4 teams, and we'll continue to maintain 4 teams going forward, will be slightly smaller than they are right now because certain positions would no longer be required. And they'll be based on the postulated events, which again are based on a permanently defueled and shut down plant, and one that is really just storing fuel at that point. So again, a very robust emergency plan remains in place. Initial staffing changes are the result of the shutdown, consistent with the updated risk assessment. The significant reduction in potential events as a result of the fact that we're defueled, and many of our systems at that point will be abandoned and laid up. And then essentially the events that we can have, loss of inventory, loss of cooling to spent fuel pool, these take periods of time. And we'll have all of the same mitigative strategies available to make up to the spent fuel pool, to address anything having to do with the cooling of the fuel. So it provides us with this additional time and therefore allows us to minimize a little bit the overall emergency plan staffing and the events that will it have leading to the declaration of the different type of emergency levels. So the emergency response organization would be focused on the restoration of equipment that supports spent fuel cooling and inventory, and that will be the primary focus. We will still have a technical support center and an operations support center, that's the TSC and OSC, so those would remain in place. Those are both located at the site. Again, elimination of credible accidents involving anything having to do with the reactor provides us additional time to plan and execute and assess really the impact of what we have to do for these events. They don't impact our ability to assess and monitor actual or potential off-site consequences, so we'll still have off-site monitoring, we'll still have our off-site teams. They obviously will just be focused on an event that will probably take much longer before it would be any issue. And then, again, appropriate assessment and mitigation are within the capabilities of our slightly reduced staff, and we'll also have the emergency operations facility located off-site to support and to direct all emergency functions during that 10-month period of time for this particular change. So the next one would be called the permanently defueled E-plan changes. Again, it's a emergency plan that will look very much like the one we have right now. It will allow us to further reduce the overall staff. And again, it's based on the fact that over that 10-month period of time, the fuel will have the ability to cool. One of the accidents that we have to design for early on is a spent fuel pool fire or a zirconium fire. That's if all of the water was to leave the spent fuel pool and the fuel was to heat up hot enough to start a fire. That risk will change over the 10-month cooling period. That's a calculation that we have developed and have to have approved by the NRC as part of our changes to the emergency plan. Our off-site emergency measures would be consistent with an all hazards planning approach. In other words, we would use the resources that we have and we'd be able to call in resources because the time frames that we need them would be much less. So we'd have the ability to notify and bring in resources in a period of time that allows us to lessen what we need on site at all times. The emergency planning zone, which of course is 10 miles today, it will be 10 miles through that first change. It would be likely reduced to the site boundary. That's what our request will be with the NRC, commensurate again with that reduced risk. But our actions would be consistent with the EPA Protective Action Guidelines or PAG manual. So we still follow all those rules and guidance. Emergency action levels will be again designed specifically to spent fuel pool and the ISFC type accidents, radiological conditions, hazards, systems that might not function. And what that would do is it will change the type of events we can have. So right now we can have the lowest level in an unusual event, followed by an alert, followed by a site area emergency, followed by a general emergency. The two more significant ones would no longer be required because all of the accident type scenarios would be at the fence. So we would only have two types of events. One would be an unusual event and the other one would be an alert. That would be a significant change to the overall strategy. Declaration times will change a little bit. We'll again maintain the capability to assess, classify, and declare emergencies as soon as possible, and we would have a time limit of no later than 30 minutes after the event has been identified to notify folks that we are in the midst. We would continue to notify MEMA, the state of Massachusetts, the town of Plymouth as soon as possible, and again, our limit there would be within 60 minutes of declaration or change in classification. Our augmentation time for the response organization would be 2 hours within an alert classification. Right now, we would have everybody together within 1 hour, so we're allowed additional time because of the type of events. And we would have a reduced fire brigade as defined in our fire protection plan. However, we will continue to, as we do right now, work with the town of Plymouth and neighboring towns to bring in, additional fire protection and firefighting if necessary. Our emergency response organization will have 3 leaders. One is an emergency director. That will be the control room supervisor, so we won't have to bring in somebody from the outside. All the control room operators and supervisors will be trained to assume the position of emergency director once the emergency classification's been made, and he will he will assume overall command and control and make the notifications with his staff. We'll then have a technical coordinator who will respond to the control room. He'll advise the emergency director on all issues associated with any sort of actions we have to take with our maintenance organization or have to go out and fix things at the plant. And then the last position will be called a radiological protection coordinator. He will again respond to the control room and work with the emergency director, and he'll advise him on any radiological issues and coordinate any of the radiation protection activities on site as a result of the event, if there are any.
Joe, are those people already on site?
Yes. Yep. So the proposed schedule, and again, you're dealing with requesting NRC approval, so what you do is you request targets or milestones with the NRC, and essentially at that point, it's really up to their resources. But the first change, the post-shutdown emergency plan, license amendment requests, as I had mentioned, we submitted it in January of this year. We're requesting approval by January of next year, and that would have it here in enough time to implement it in the June to July timeframe of 2019. So we built in about 6 months of margin. The permanently defueled emergency plan license amendment request has not been submitted, so we haven't obviously targeted an approval date, but again, the target there is April of 2020, about 10 months after we shut down and defuel. Current requirements, responsibilities, processes, and procedures will remain in place until we have the approval for these, so nothing will change between now and June of 2019. And the current requirements maintain in place until all the exemptions and the license amendment requests are approved by the NRC. I'll be happy to take any questions.
That fine?
So your emergency plan is, for the post-shutdown, is going to be in January 2019. Does that mean the entire PSDAR is going to be in January of 2019?
The changes of the emergency plan won't start until July of 2019.
But I mean, you're saying the plan will be submitted in January. At least I think that's.
No,
what
that's the submittal to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Those are separate from things like the PSDAR. Those are all licensing actions that we have to take in order to make all this happen.
So the two aren't linked?
They're not linked.
The exemption was already submitted, July 3rd.
That's correct.
Any other questions? I have one, Joe. It's sort of more arcane. Walk us through the current wet storage and what the space allocation you anticipate as the assemblies come out. Because there's quite a few in there, and what do you see as sort of the scenario on that?
You mean as far as offloading fuel from the spent fuel pool
Yeah.
to the dry cask?
Mhm.
So each of the dry cask storage canisters, as John mentioned, contains 68 fuel assemblies. The dry casks are actually rated thermally, so.
I'm sorry, I probably wasn't clear. What I'm interested in is, what's the availability now within the wet storage area? Because that's the first step.
Right.
How much space do you have, and how much more can you handle in that?
By October.
I guess I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. You know, at the end of October, we'll have 1,200 on the pad, so we'll have, I think, just under 3,000. Maybe John has the numbers off the top of his head.
We'll have, after this campaign that finishes in October, we'll have full core offload capability within the spent fuel pool.
So that much will be freed up.
Correct.
That's 580 is in the reactor right now. So we'll have an excess of that, so we'll always have the minimum of 580 in the pool.
So the intention would be, is as quickly as possible after actual shutdown, is to get them into wet storage and out of that.
Yeah, that's
All
what
of
he
them.
said. So then they can
Is
get
that the
rid of
plan?
Well, it's after we shut down, we have a schedule that will disassemble the reactor, go right into defueling the reactor, and then, as Joe had pointed out, we'll put on our application for a cessation of operations at that time, certify that we're shut down permanently, but one of the wickets we have to get through in order to put that paperwork into the NRC is to have all fuel out of the reactor.
So you don't have any concerns at this point about capacity and wet storage?
No.
No. And before we can offload all the fuel from the pool, the 580 that just came out of the reactor do have to cool for a period of time
Yep.
to meet the design of the canisters. I think that's 2 to 2.5 years. Rich?
Joe, you piqued my interest when you mentioned that you have a different, or that Holtec has made an adjustment to their dry cask. Is that to accommodate a hotter fuel cell sooner, or is that include survivability changes, or what are you talking about here?
My understanding, and this will be a great question if we can get Dr. Singh scheduled for one of the future meetings. Metallurgically, they're made differently now, so they have materials that can handle a higher heat load. So they're licensed to handle a higher thermal capacity. Therefore, you can put newer fuel, if you will, in them than the previous design.
Does that affect the risk management process that you would use for transferring from wet to dry?
No. Nope, there's still going to be a period of time that they have to be cooled so that the total thermal capacity of the 68 that are in that cask still meet the tech specs. Essentially, the casks are approved by the NRC. Their design is approved by the NRC. So it doesn't change anything on our end. We still have to determine which fuel goes where, and there's you don't put them just into one location. They actually have specific slots assigned to them, both from the pool and into the cask, so that we have uniform loading and we don't exceed the thermal limits.
Does the new Holtec accommodate the same as the original, or whatever the older one, 68 fuel assemblies?
They're the same capacity, 68.
Mr. Chairman, I think Joe has made a great recommendation, and we also talked about it before. We got to get these guys in here.
Joe has been helping us try to get a scheduled date for him, since he's worked with them a lot more in the past. Yes, Joe?
Joe, is the reason that the period of roughly 2.5 years that you mentioned, that the spent fuel rods, once they come out of the reactor, have to cool down before you can move them into the dry cask? Didn't it used to be sort of 3 to 5 years? And if that was the case and it's now less, is it because of the new technology and the capability of the new casks?
Right. The fuel doesn't cool any faster or anything like that. It's just that the cask design now can handle the higher heat load overall. Yep.
But that does increase the risk. If you've got a hotter fuels assembly in the dry cask, and the dry cask has a measured survivability, doesn't that increase the risk?
Well, part of the licensing of the new cask would have had to do a risk evaluation to determine whether or not the new cask design meets NRC regulations, and that was recently approved by the NRC. So, again, it comes down to technology and the way they fabricate the cask, but the guy who needs to answer these questions is going to be at a future meeting.
Do you have any sense of when his availability might be?
I think we're targeting
October.
October.
Yeah, okay.
That's correct.
Okay. Did you have a question or comment?
No, I was just going to talk to as far as risk goes, we evaluate risk again, as far as a fuel bundle being either in the fuel pool or in a cask. So the technology behind the cask is one thing, but both of those are also evaluated. Where is the best place for that, that spent fuel? So there's some risk involved with being in a spent fuel pool. There's some risk involved in being in a cask. So we evaluate that also.
David, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm curious about the planning, the emergency planning zone. So I'm guessing there are regulations or guidance that NRC gives you to help develop what that plan zone looks like, and when it shrinks, and how you respond to certain incidents as far as coordination with the town and with the state. When you make these decisions to adjust your emergency plans, do you validate that with local officials to make sure that it's realistic what you're proposing, kind of as it lines up with real time? So, for example, do you go to Kurt and say, hey, this is what we're thinking, we've got to, worst case scenario, be able to evacuate everybody in 25 hours? Is that something that's realistic? And do you get input from state and local officials on whether they're gonna be able to carry forward what you're putting out as your emergency plans?
So we've already started our outreach, both at the director level. I gave a presentation a week and a half ago to the 6 emergency directors in the Northeast, including MEMA, in anticipation of the changes. And then we meet monthly in a group called the Pilgrim Working Group. And this is all of the EPZ town, emergency directors, fire chiefs, police chiefs, and we provide them with the information. But we're going to have to develop these plans. The plans will have to be trained. The plans will have to be shared with the towns, let them know what their role is going to be. And anything that we submit to the NRC, of course, is open to public comment. So if there's any questions, hopefully we can answer them, at a local level rather than, through the NRC. But that's one of the avenues that's available to anybody who has questions. What we're proposing follows the regulations, and there's a precedent set by a large number of plants that preceded us into decommissioning.
But is it your goal to kind of get the blessing from local and state officials on what you're proposing to make sure that it's realistic before it gets evaluated by the NRC? Or do you just rely on the towns and the state to submit public comments about what you've proposed?
Well, certainly our goal would be to get their concurrence, but I think right now it's in the education phase, and if there's any questions or concerns, we take them in and we consider them, and if necessary, evaluate them and include them as part of our application to the NRC. But they will ultimately decide whether we can, shrink the emergency planning zone down to the site boundaries. Once the events are no longer going to leave the site, you no longer need towns 10 miles away to support that plan. And the process that the NRC goes through, which evaluates our analysis and risk, takes into consideration, what you're going to need locally. Certainly the host community will still be part of the emergency plan going forward, and we recognize that, and we've communicated that to Plymouth. So that would be kind of our focus for this last change to the emergency plan.
Any other questions? Fine.
Joe, a couple of years ago, there were, this is a spent fuel pool question. There were some significant problems with the boron panels in between. Can you tell us, were all of those fixed? Is there an ongoing, inspection of those boron panels so that we're assured that they can take us another 6 years down the road?
We have evaluated that issue. I might need some help from John. We didn't, I don't think, went in repair. We just don't use those racks anymore that have the materials that were in question. So that's how we dispositioned, I think, that particular issue, is by ensuring we're not loading in the areas that have the concern.
Yeah, we reconfigured the spent fuel in the pool for certain spacing between bundles, whole configuration that was done through analysis by reactor engineering, our fuels group, to make sure we had the right configuration in the spent fuel pool, and that's all been completed.
Just a follow-up question, or maybe I can talk to you later about it, but if you're going to be pretty much maximizing the spent fuel pool with the reactor fuel once you cease operations, it would seem that you don't have the room to do that. So how, if the boron panels were required because you were putting 3,000 assemblies in there, and you're going to be putting 3,000 assemblies in there, how are you getting away without it? I guess that's really my question.
Well, to repeat the answer to Sean's question, we have a campaign that's ongoing right now. In October, when we finish with that the campaign currently underway, we'll have enough room in the spent fuel pool to effect a full core offload.
And to have space, so you're not going to have 3,000 assemblies in there. You're going to have half of that.
As I said, we'll have enough room in the spent fuel pool for a full core offload.
Right, so currently we are
staying within the
configured.
regulation.
Right, currently we're configured to handle all of our fuel that's stored in the pool, in addition to the issue that was identified with the panels. We're now loading 9 additional, which will give us in excess of the 580 slots that we need for the, what's remaining in the core, and we'll still have.
But I was trying to do the math, so maybe I can get the math at some point.
Yep, I can get you the math, yeah.
Just to clarify one more. So essentially, you've quarantined off that other space. That's not included in the calculation of the available space for the full offload.
No, that's not what he's saying.
Correct. To not use that
That's
space,
right,
right?
yeah.
We'll have the pool configured the way we have it now, so to your point, Pine, I should have been more clear, and I apologize. We're removing enough fuel so that when we can continue with that configuration and get a full core, and affect a full core offload once we defuel.
So what's the capacity of the spent fuel pool right now?
I don't have that number. I can get that for you, though,
Okay, that'd be great.
if you'd like, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes,
But
Joe?
the process is continuous. In other words, as you're ready to remove some of the spent fuel rods to dry cask storage, that frees up space. And then as you're ready to, or will be ready to remove the rods from the reactor, once you shut down, it's going to be ongoing on both ends. You can remove as you've got more space because you're moving things to dry cask, so you're constantly freeing up space to move more of the rods from the reactor.
Yeah, it's a bulk move now, and then a bulk move then, correct, but essentially, yes, Joe.
Any other questions? Yeah, Jess.
So just 2 questions, and they don't need to be addressed this evening, but one is, it seems like the timeline is very dependent on NRC approving a number of requests. So just wondering if those requests are denied, how does that impact your timeline? And it just would be interesting to see sort of what the expedited timeline is versus the timeline. And then the second follow-up question is, has Entergy made requests of the NRC when it relates to this type of thing? Have there been denials in the past? Because it seems like you're pretty clear on that you would be requesting and that the assumption is that it would be allowed. So just trying to get a sense of what the probability of that is.
Yeah, I wouldn't speculate on the probability. I was licensing manager for 7 years, so I dealt with the NRC and all of our submittals, and it really comes down to the quality of the work you do, the analysis, making sure that it's adequate and meets the NRC regulations. There are going to be questions back and forth specific on the submittal, and we expect to be able to answer those questions. But the first question, if we don't get approval, we'll continue with the emergency plan as we have it right now.
Okay.
Until we reach a point where the NRC does approve it. And
The NRC has never denied an exemption.
Thank you.
well, EP exemption.
Correct.
They
But
issue
isn't the-
exemptions all the time.
But I think the issue is more, at what point will the exemption be granted, right?
Right.
So you're looking for something, a 10-month, April of 2020. You don't know whether it'll really be effective April 2020. It could be as far out as January 2021. So, isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're applying for it now, roughly 20 months before we need it, to provide additional margin in case the NRC gets busy with something else, asks us for more information. They will not tell you, you're going to get it in a year. You go by kind of precedent set. So we're building margin into it based on the experience from other sites.
And it sounds like it's more of a discussion as opposed to just a decision point, right? To your point, if you work with NRC until you would get the exemption, as opposed to it being a yes or a no.
So there'll be two things required. One is the exemption from their regulations, and the second is the change to our license to allow us to implement. So they kind of go hand in hand. The exemptions to the regulations, I think, will go fairly straightforward because others have already done them, so it's not anything Pilgrim specific. The second one is very Pilgrim specific, so at this point, we're using other plants' experience, Vermont Yankee and some of the other decommissioning plants. something could change in the industry between now and then that requires them to impose additional requirements. So you really are kind of speculating. They may impose conditions that would extend it, that we right now can't anticipate, but they may say, we want you to keep the plan in place for an additional year for whatever reason. And we'll be prepared to do that. It means just keeping the staff for a longer period of time trained and available to implement the plan.
Any other questions? With that, thank you very much, Joe, and I'll be talking to you about Dr. Singh and the other presentations. We're going to move on to this 5th agenda item, which is the public comment and questions. We've allocated 20 minutes for it this evening. In keeping with our tradition, how many people would like to speak this evening? 1, 2, 3, 4. So everybody gets 5 minutes, and we'll start. Chuck, you can go first. Please say your name so that Alan can get it for the minutes.
Chuck 80, I'm a Plymouth resident for 40-something years. I've been working in the industry for about 50 years, and I've had about 20 years in the decommissioning area. I would like to thank the committee for all their hard work, and I know the sacrifices you have to make to do it. And I have to comment that this is a very well-run organization, and you've done a great job. Thank you. I do take one exception to one of the recommendations that's been offered, and that has to do with the reduction of the cleanup regulation from the NRC requirement of 25 millirem to the proposed 10 millirem per year. I've been involved in the industry for a long time, and when I was first working in it, the average American received 360 millirems a year of radiation from natural background, medical, and actually power production, which was only 1 millirem a year. The majority of that was medical exposure. Today, that is 760 millirem per year, and the increase is basically from medical exposure. And while there probably has not been any epidemiological study of that impact on the average American, we don't see any major health effects from receiving that additional amount of radiation. That amount of radiation is averaged over the entire population. The entire population isn't getting this medical exposure. So if it was averaged over the actual people that got the radiation, it would be substantially higher, I believe. There have been studies with respect to what amount of radiation is acceptable. The basis for the systems that we have right now is this linear no threshold, which assumes that any radiation down to 0 is harmful. There are other schools of thought that, and a lot of science and research has gone into this hormesis theory, which has concluded that a certain level of radiation is necessary. We've evolved over millions of years with a large background radiation, and that has been implemented and involved in the establishment of our own immune systems. And they believe that there is some certain level of radiation that is necessary. Now, we're talking about a standard of this 25 millirem per year. That's based on a model that to receive that 25 millirem per year, you would have to live on the site year-round. You would have to grow your own food on the site. You'd have to have your own cow and drink the milk from the cow that grazed on the site, and you'd have to drink all your water from a well on the site. And the site right now is industrial, and it probably will be an industrial site for a long time to come, and over that period of time, those dose rates will release. And so I don't think there is any real benefit to be observed by reducing that by another 15 millirem per year. And the cost of doing that could be quite substantial. And I believe that money that could be saved by not going to that new standard could be put to much better use.
Thank you, Chuck. Rich?
Good evening, panel. I want to comment and expand upon Mr. Nichols' concern about the shrinkage of the EPZ distance from 10-mile radius down to the site boundary that Joe was describing. And part of my comment relates to my experience serving on the NMC when I had the pleasure of participating in quite a number of annual, semi-annual emergency drills of the Pilgrim Plant in the event of a nuclear radiological emergency. I might need a little help from Kurt and Jack on this. I'm a little rusty since it's been a couple of years. I'm going to just start with an operating nuclear plant. My recollection was that the 10-mile radius was focusing on an enveloping type of radiological emergency whereby the most consequential release of fission products would be radioactive gaseous and particulate iodine, of which that's why the potassium iodide pills were handed out to those in the public who may want to have that. But in a 10-mile radius, the expectation, at least of the NRC, was that the material would settle out, could be washed out or rained out or snowed out of the atmosphere. And for EP purposes, for emergency evacuation or sheltering in place decisions, that's how the 10-mile radius came about. So when you have a permanently shut down nuclear plant and you're just talking about fuel being stored in the pool and or a dry cask, my understanding, at least from what I reviewed at the time from the NRC regulatory guides, that you're not really worrying about radioactive iodine. There are other radionuclides that could be associated with a shutdown plant in terms of the pool or the IFC there. But my question, maybe for Jack, I'm sorry, for I'm not sure, for Joe, sorry about that. See, you get senior moments when you get close to 70. For Joe, is that if there were, in the likely event of radiological emergency, and you have the EPZ shrunk right to the site boundary, it would seem that you could still have radionuclides going beyond the immediate site boundary, getting out past Rocky Hill Road, Beaver Dam Road, maybe getting to my house 4 miles southwest and further. So how would you envision in your request to the NRC to shrink the EPZ boundary to the site boundary to interface with the town departments, the fire, the police, other emergency officials, in terms of protective actions that still might need to be taken if there was an off-site or beyond site boundary release?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Rich. And I think the best way to answer it is that is the submittal that we're developing right now. So I would offer in the future to provide an update on specifically what's being planned to be submitted to the NRC to get their approval on that particular change to the emergency plan. I can't comment. I haven't seen it myself, but.
A little bit into the weeds on this, how there could be a basis for shrinking, but there's still considerations that we have immediate site boundary that see boundary that's located.
Yeah,
Joe,
absolutely. Very good question.
Joe, let me ask you, what would be an approximate time to put another update on that on the agenda? Would it be September, October, when, based on the preparation of the submittal now?
I would say as soon as we have that submittal ready, the next meeting, I have TBD on there because I don't have a date from licensing, but I would think the September, October timeframe would be appropriate.
I'll confirm it with you beforehand rather than, okay.
That'd be fine.
Jim?
Jim Lampert. It's first just a matter for a follow-up again on what Dave Nichols said. I'm on a committee in Duxbury that is in regular contact with our emergency planning director. And I think there are a couple of things that this panel needs to recognize, because one of your goals, I would hope, would be to make recommendations that provide a real protection against any potential risks to the public at large, and not simply to accept, oh, the NRC says we don't need this, we don't need that. A lot of that is open to very serious questions, and one of the things I would hope you really do next year is get some independent look on, are you really comfortable with all of the assumptions that have been made by the NRC to justify what they have been doing to permit licensees to do, frankly, in many cases, as little as necessary. And with particular reference to the EPZs and what's going to happen, first thing that's going to happen is all of the towns are going to lose a lot of money. Money that they have used to train people to keep them ready in the case of an emergency. That money is going to disappear. The second thing is all of the towns have piles of emergency plans, emergency reaction plans. We review Duxbury's on an annual basis. There are serious flaws in those plans as presented to us for review by MEMA. We have for probably 10 to 15 years asked MEMA to change those plans to provide what the town thinks is necessary to provide protection. And without exception, MEMA has not accepted any of those amendments. We don't look forward to having things improve a whole hell of a lot as things go forward. Second, on this whole emergency planning, you heard Mr. Lynch's presentation on what they intend to do. Well, one of the things I heard this panel talk about a few months ago was, geez, what this NRC rule change? Frankly, you just heard it. What he told you is what the NRC rule change says it's going to do. Why is the NRC going to do it? Because they won't have to grant any more exemptions. It'll just be done automatically by regulation, and they've eliminated any public input, any site-specific input. The changes in regulations are largely based on a bunch of highly debatable assumptions by the NRC as to when risk decreases and how much and what you don't have to worry about. My wife and I provided to you some months ago an analysis of what the rule changes that the NRC is suggesting are, what assumptions they are making to justify those, and raising questions as to whether those assumptions are justified. You've got a summer vacation coming up. Over that vacation sometime, since that rule is going to go into effect, public input is going to be eliminated. Please read and think about whether you can live, whether you should force the citizens around here to live with those NRC assumptions, or whether, frankly, it's your job as members of this panel to make suggestions to the Commonwealth on what it should require to provide the protection that goes above and beyond that, and frankly, in my view, is plainly needed.
Thank you, Jim. Mary?
Yes, just to follow up on him, and I'll get on another subject. One of the assumptions, you looked at it, was somehow terrorists we understand there's an escalated risk of terrorism, but somehow NRC and Entergy has figured out that the spent fuel at Pilgrim is never to be attacked. I've heard Dan Wolf talk about the vulnerability of the spent fuel pool to an airplane attack, one of his, actually, if it were loaded with fuel and explosives. That's not considered in the assumptions of why the risk is so low within 10 months of the pool cooling, and why it would take many hours for a fire to develop, and it could be put out by the pulley system that they have for supplemental water, which is a joke. No, none of this makes sense, and I'm really surprised you didn't comment on that, Dan. And I'm surprised that you didn't comment, Rich, on the security issues that are involved and the vulnerability by experts the Attorney General of Massachusetts has used. Oh, and I've sent you those reports showing the pool is vulnerable to a terrorist attack, indicating specifically what weapons are available on the internet that can penetrate a dry cask. So the risks are there. The studies have been done. I think it's your job to read those studies instead of taking what's fed by Entergy, and they're a business. They're a business, and a business is concerned with the bottom line. We also heard from a member of the public tonight about hormesis, the theory that radiation, nope, not bad for you, but actually good for you. I think in reality, the authorities to go to are the National Academies of Sciences, Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation. They're appointed by Congress to get the experts in the country to look at the effects of ionizing radiation. Their latest report, Beer 7, has a whole big chapter on hormesis. They didn't actually call it junk science, but that was the conclusion. So I wouldn't go out and try to get an extra dose of radiation for your health. He also questioned what good would lowering it be from the standard that the NRC has. Now, if the risk was from exposure to a chemical, EPA and DEP would say the risk of getting cancer would be 1 in 100,000. Now, going to Beer 7, the National Academies, and doing the math, all you have to do is read, start on page 9. You can see that from 25 millirem, the risk estimated for cancer is 175 people per 100,000. At least if you drop it to 10, and hopefully less than 10, you drop the risk to 70. So there is a significant difference. The 25 is based on age-old estimates of the health effects of radiation. We in this committee should take their hat off to Mass Department of Public Health and say, you know, you are concerned about the public's health and are going to rely upon the most recent science from independent national experts to make your judgments. Also, you could say, hey, what's fair is fair. If the state has a limit of 10 millirem a year for its licensees, why should we, who are impacted by Pilgrim, perhaps, get more? That's not fair, right? And so I think it's time to put it to bed, and I congratulate this group for recommending support of the MOU. I'm working with environmental groups in the state, and we are planning to go further. We not only want an MOU as stated by DPH, but if Entergy doesn't get off the dime and agree to the MOU, the state has an option. Mass Department of Public Health should issue a regulation that this is what it will have to be when the license is terminated, when it's decommissioned. Done. So there are two ways to skin this cat. And I would hope next year, in September, you might consider that to be a recommendation. That if Entergy doesn't agree to the MOU, then we're going to have a regulation. So we can do it one way or another. Thank you very much.
Look forward to seeing you in September.
Isn't that a song?
Probably, Thank you very much.
I'll see you in September.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, could I make a comment?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
You're absolutely right, Mary. I did not interject. I did talk with the chairman and the vice chairman today about the security issues. But I'd like to point out to you, including in Dr. Thompson's report, the risks that are identified in there are for operating nuclear plants. What I'm trying to get my hands around, and hopefully the panel as well, is the vulnerability of the ISFSI.
I sent it to you once, and I will send it again. And I will send it to the whole panel.
You sound like my mother.
There's analysis.
Thank you, Mary.
Okay.
Thanks.
I get a lot of emails, too.
We're gonna move on to the next agenda item.
Point of
Oh, I'm
information
sorry.
on that?
Yes,
For the
please.
good Mr. Grassi, though. Just to clarify, I think, and Mr. Priest can back me up on this, if not, NDG would consider, or MEMA, okay, that what's being argued is not its vulnerability, spent fuel in a shielded cask, that the cask would be as vulnerable at month 9 as it would be month 10, okay? But rather the radioisotopes contained within it, okay? You would no longer have any gases, okay, that would be released were it to be pierced. And so I
So-
think we have to look at it from multiple facets.
Can I respond to that?
Go ahead, Jeff.
So, there was a lot of technical terms that were thrown around today as we're trying to learn all of this information, emergency planning zone, the 10-mile EPZ, the site boundary. We heard a member of the public talk about fission gases and the design-based accidents. The simple point, particularly with regards to our 10 millirem in a year limit. And we heard some comments about hormesis. Mary talked about the National Academy of Science, the International Council of Radiation Protection, the National Council of Radiation Protection, the American Board of Health Physics do not recognize hormesis. There are people that are trying to disprove that, as there are people trying to prove and disprove other scientific facts. The best information that we have right now and our regulatory basis is based on the linear non-threshold model. And that means any amount of radiation has some risk associated with it. So in Massachusetts, for my licensees, they're required to meet a less than 10 millirem in a year when they have an unrestricted use of the site, meaning that there are no controls, there are no fences, you can do whatever you want to do at that site. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, when they wrote their regulation, used a value of 25. The value of 10 is less than 25. There's less risk associated with 10 than there is at 25. We had the NRC in here. They told us that the other plants, 7 other plants that have decommissioned, easily met the 10 without a significant financial difference. So before we go down the path to try to write a new set of regulations on something I think that already currently exists, we are engaged with Entergy, and we're working through a memo of understanding, and I believe we'll be able to come to a mutually agreed agreement as we work through that. So we'll keep the panel updated on that. I think that's going to be more work for the working group across the state. You know, we talked about the design-based accident with a cask. I mean, a design-based accident is the meltdown, a large amounts of radioactive out in the community, okay? My concern with the reduction in the emergency planning zone is making sure we have funding for the community fire departments and emergency directors that would have to respond to a fire on the plant, a trash fire on the plant in a radioactive area where they're doing decommissioning. Doesn't matter whether it's, all the public's gonna be concerned with is there's radioactive material past the site boundary in the community. The fence line, everything doesn't magically stop at the fence line. So that's where I think we need to be engaged with Entergy to ensure that we continue to have adequate resources and training for the people in the community. They're gonna have to work with that industrial site. It's no different than if Pilgrim was a refinery or some other heavy industry where you would have an all hazards training for your fire department and funding and things like that to work through with that. So,
I think we can all say, Jack, we're happy you're at the table with these discussions. On to the next agenda item, which is the nominations for next year's chairs. Is there another point? Oh, I'm sorry, Senator. I couldn't believe I overlooked.
Real quickly, first of all, I want to applaud the panel and Kurt and the other folks from the agencies and secretariats here. I'm just going to state the obvious. What this panel needs to be doing is making sure that there is a vehicle and a process for people who have authority and regulatory ability to actually affect change and to speak on behalf of the Commonwealth and the citizens of the Commonwealth. This panel has none of that. And so I think the success thus far is the creation of the Interagency Working Group. There's accountability because that lives in the executive branch through the Secretariat and through the agencies. And I think we have to be laser focused on the relationship with that group and this entity. All that we're learning is great. I think we have to keep learning, and I applaud bringing in outside experts, and I love the input we're getting from the public. But the reality is, if we're going to actually affect change and put a finger on the scale of what happens, we have to look at this now as a political and a power play and identify where we have power and through what entities and agencies we do. And that's going to be through the working group. So I really look forward to hearing about what the relationship between this panel and that interagency working group is going to be, such that the citizens have a voice through us into that interagency group, and that we actually, as we get more information, have the ability to interface with that group, because that's actually going to be the path to speaking to Entergy and to speaking to the NRC. It is not this panel. It's going to be the creation of this panel through the cooperation of the executive branch and the governor. And I just want to say I really appreciate that. That's a very positive outcome in a year. We just have to keep the pressure on.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think as a collective group, one of our single best accomplishments this year was to work with the administration to get the interagency group done, because I don't think anybody 12 months ago would have envisioned that, and we're making great progress with that. And everybody, and I'm going to include Entergy, who I know has already been talking with them. We're getting on the same page. It's not always easy, and I absolutely agree with you, Senator.
And that's the beginning of a process. It's not the end of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is very early on, very early on. Any other comments before we go to the next agenda item? Kurt, did you want to say something about, before we get into the nominations?
Sure. I can do this very shortly, very briefly.
Lyndon Johnson style?
If asked, I will not
Yeah.
serve. After considering a number of factors and consulting with the administration that I work for, I need to step out of the role of co-chair. The state is going to be very focused in working in the working group, the interagency working group. As you think about chair or chairs moving forward, it cannot, one of those positions cannot be me. It's been a great year, been a great working relationship, and I can tell you that the interagency working group very much is a product of the panel's focus on it, the recommendations, the advocacy by others. The working group, there's a very direct relationship between the work this panel did and where the administration is now. So, but moving forward, I just need to be in a different role on the panel as the state begins doing much more work in another forum, and we'll look to build those bridges, and that's maybe another role for me. But
Okay. Well, on behalf of myself, and I know everybody else, can't thank you enough for all the work you did this year, and you deserve a lot of credit for the progress that we've made. With that, anybody's got nominations for the chair and vice chair? It will be chair and vice chair next year, not a co-chairs. Any nominations?
I point fingers?
Sure.
Can I ask my brother Kevin Riley if he'd be interested in having a role here?
Mr. O'Reilly?
I don't know if I should say thank you, Pine, or not.
I just know you're not doing anything.
Yeah, nothing much. Not as chair, but I would be willing to have my name thrown in as vice chair in nomination.
Any other nominations?
Well, I would think Mr. Sean Mullen himself, by virtue of his past experience, would be our best choice as chair.
I second that.
That is very nice of you, Paul. Are there any other nominations? Hearing none, I guess we've got me renominated as chair and Kevin as vice chair, is that?
Got to vote.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Good luck to you, Kevin.
Awesome.
Congratulations. Kevin has no idea, does he, Chris?
Awesome.
He has no idea. Thank you. That applause should be for you.
So can I just, going forward for the time being and until, unless you want to do it differently, I'm happy to continue supporting you in the management of the, because the website and the meeting notices has become a state function. I'm happy to continue managing the posting of meetings and taking care of all the notices and continue working with EOEEA that manages the website until we, so.
And I just really want to thank you for doing that, because
Yeah.
what a pain in the...
Oh, God. That's not easy.
Unless
Really,
unless
thank
I
you very
miss anything, Pine is quick on the follow-up. Where is that posting? So thank you.
Are there any new business items that we haven't discussed?
John, when are you or do you have a plan at this point, a rough target for sort of the agenda for this second year? You know, we've talked in the past, not just the president of Holtac, but we talked about other experts from different areas to try and see if we can get them to further educate the panel on additional technical things that impact all of this. Any early thoughts as to when we might start talking about a draft of who those folks might be?
I have to give you a little insight into how Kurt and I have worked over the past year. One of the suggestions that had come in was that to lay out for everybody's benefit when the meetings would be over the next year. So in my typical OCD manner, I gave Kurt the long list by date, by time, location of what we'd be doing. And I have a comparable list of some ideas that I would like to share. Kurt smartly and correctly said, well, why don't we turn this into a 1-2 sentence thing on the website about the monthly meetings and PCIS? And I said, you know, you're right, because, so to answer your question, Joe, I do have a list laid out. It's based on, I think, 3 meetings worth of suggestions and comments that were made. What I will promise you, I've got a very difficult week for the rest of the week, actually through the end of next week. But I will, during the first part of August or earlier, I'm going to send it out to all the panel members. With the more, Kurt doesn't mind, I'll give him his emeritus status on this one. I'll send out all the dates, because I think it's helpful. For me, anyway, I put them all on the calendar so I don't foul it up. And it's very helpful to hear with Kathleen Sullivan, who, in absentia, deserves a lot of our credit, because there's only one person in the school system that coordinates all these meetings. And we have inundated her over the year. And between Kathleen, the PCAS, the superintendent, and the folks from PACTV, I mean, these people have been phenomenal in terms of helping us. But I will send out a list to all of you with all the dates that are scheduled for next year and confirmed with her, unless we make a change in location, with its comparable list of what might be on store. Because, you know, I've listened real carefully, and Senator Wolf has frequently mentioned about the expert stuff, and I know there's a lot of disagreement about that. We got some, but we are here to learn, and we are here to give our best advice, and we need over the next 2 months to figure out how is the working relationship between the panel and the interagency group. But it's moving, I gotta tell you, having been, I would say, intimately involved in some of these discussions, it's moving much more quickly than I think any of us could have ever hoped. And that's a tribute to Kurt and to all the other folks in the administration, as well as to us, and perhaps our tenacity, so.
If you would just consider along those lines, and I know it's probably an inconvenience, but at some time in this second year, I think it might be helpful if the two groups could get together.
Absolutely.
So we could just get to know
Yeah.
who was on
Absolutely.
the new state interagency working group, which is often helpful
you.
when we're coming up with recommendations, and if they have met us once, and, you know, whether that's once a year or twice a year, we get together, whatever, I think that can always help working
Yeah,
relationships
absolutely.
between the groups.
And I think, Joe, I was surprised, quite frankly, in the new business that this topic didn't come up directly. I think whenever the liaison is designated, that's the first request we make of the liaison, to say when and where, and let's do it. Any other points for this evening before I look for a motion to adjourn? Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? All in favor? Aye. Thanks.
Oh,
We're 30 minutes early.